In a world where power speaks in silence and nations bow to the weight of history, one man dares to stand against it all. This is the untold story of Ibrahim Traoré, a story of betrayal, sacrifice, and a struggle that shook the very foundations of the colonial order. Tonight, you will witness a tale of despair and defiance, of a leader who refused to kneel, and a people who began to rise. Before we begin this journey, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that the world tries to silence. The night was heavy with shadows. Far from the deserts of Africa, in the heart of Washington, D.C., a gathering took place behind marble walls and glass towers. A circle of men, bound not by loyalty to nations but by centuries of power, studied a single name written across the briefing files before them: Ibrahim Traoré. They spoke of him as one speaks of a problem, an obstacle, a fracture in the carefully laid foundations of empire. He was young, unyielding, unpredictable, a soldier who dared to stand where many before him had been cut down. To them, he was dangerous not because of weapons or armies, but because of an idea. The idea that Africa did not need chains. The ultimatum was clear: submit to the old colonial order, or face ruin. Sanctions tightened like a noose. Food routes were severed. Trade collapsed overnight. In the villages of Burkina Faso, children wept not from war, but from hunger. Entire families watched their harvests rot, unable to sell or transport them. The desert winds carried not just dust, but despair. Whispers traveled through the night. Assassination plots, coups, betrayals. Invisible hands reached into his army, his government, even his own council. And yet, in Ouagadougou, the young captain refused to bow. No one expected what came next. Not the West, not the generals plotting in silence, not even those who prayed for deliverance. What Traoré did in the face of the ultimatum would leave Donald Trump speechless, and the world trembling. Ibrahim Traoré's rise had never been a story of smooth ascension. It was a tale forged in fire, in betrayal, in the weight of history that refused to die. He was born into a land whose soil still bore scars of colonial plunder, where rivers ran through fields once stripped for gold, cotton, and blood. Burkina Faso had always been a pawn in a larger game, first by empire, then by corporations, then by the invisible strings of debt. But in the silence of those endless deserts, something was awakening. Traoré was not the first to dream of liberation. Decades earlier, Thomas Sankara had carried the torch, standing defiant against the empire, refusing loans, demanding dignity. But Sankara was silenced by bullets, betrayed by allies, erased from history books written by those who feared him most. His vision, however, lingered, like a haunting melody only the brave could hear. It was this melody that guided Traoré, a soldier shaped by hunger and by duty. Unlike the polished politicians of Paris or Washington, he carried scars of the earth itself, cracked boots, weary eyes, a heart hardened by watching his people starve while gold and cotton slipped away to foreign banks. When he seized power, the world dismissed him as another coup-maker. The headlines called him reckless, radical, unprepared. But the people knew. They saw something different. They saw Sankara's ghost return in flesh. They saw a man unafraid to say the words others buried: "We will not kneel." The reaction was swift. The IMF, angered by his refusal to hand over gold reserves, announced new sanctions. The French government cut military aid. American advisors withdrew, warning of instability. Prices of basic foods tripled overnight. Mothers carried skeletal children in their arms, whispering prayers that never seemed to reach the heavens. And in the background, in the hidden corridors of power, a darker game unfolded. 3 generals, relics of the old order, saw Traoré as a threat to their comfortable alliances with foreign masters. To them, his defiance was not bravery, but suicide, and his failure could become their opportunity. They spoke in silence, in coded letters, in shadows of military compounds where loyalty was bought with promises of wealth. But Traoré was not blind. Through whispers, he learned of their plots. Through fragments of intelligence, he saw the knives being sharpened in the dark. And yet, instead of retreating, he pressed forward with something no one expected. A plan shrouded in mystery, as if guided by invisible hands. For hidden in the archives of Ouagadougou, in dusty boxes marked for destruction, his aides uncovered something extraordinary, encrypted letters written in Sankara's hand. Letters never seen by the public, letters that spoke not only of liberation, but of secrets buried deep within the vaults of history. What they contained was unclear. Fragments of treaties, codes, names of banks siphoning Africa's wealth. But one thing was certain, they were dangerous. Dangerous enough to dismantle the facade of colonial legitimacy itself. The discovery left Traoré at a crossroads. To reveal them meant war with powers far beyond his reach. To remain silent meant betraying everything Sankara had died for. As he pondered his move, the suffering of his people deepened. Hunger became an epidemic. Bread disappeared from markets. Schools closed as children fainted from emptiness. Soldiers patrolled not to defend, but to distribute scraps of rice to the desperate. The desert sun scorched the land, but it was despair that truly burned. In Washington, the Council of Power, a circle of businessmen, generals, and politicians, debated his fate. Among them sat Trump, watching with a mix of arrogance and unease. He had seen leaders rise and fall, but something about this captain unsettled him. Perhaps it was the fire in his eyes, the audacity of youth refusing to bow to centuries of empire. The stage was being set. The pieces were moving. Africa had risen before, only to be cut down. But this time felt different. This time, in the midst of famine and betrayal, the shadows of the past whispered that something irreversible was coming, and somewhere in the depths of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré prepared to dismantle a legacy built over centuries. The world had no idea what was about to unfold. Under the blistering sun, Burkina Faso trembled on the edge of collapse. The sanctions had spread like poison, suffocating trade routes, emptying markets, and reducing life to a daily struggle for survival. Mothers carried their children to clinics where medicine no longer arrived. Soldiers who once marched with pride now counted their rations in handfuls of dry rice. The despair was not sudden. It crept in like a fog, silent, inescapable, and suffocating. But the silence of suffering was never truly silent. It carried whispers, whispers of discontent, of betrayal, of forces moving unseen. Ibrahim Traoré, who had stood defiant at the gates of empire, now found his own circle cracking under pressure. In dimly lit corridors, his closest advisors debated loyalty, some urging surrender to buy time, others secretly sending signals to foreign embassies, selling fragments of his strategies for promises of safety. It was not only foreign powers who threatened him. The three generals, relics of the colonial order, grew bolder. They tightened their grip on troops, still loyal to them, spreading rumors that Traoré's resistance would drag the nation into ruin. Soldiers who once saluted him began to doubt. Their bellies ached with hunger, their families begged for relief, and in that weakness, betrayal found fertile soil. At night, Traoré's compound filled with shadows. Reports came of strange movements, mercenaries slipping across borders, coded transmissions intercepted, drone flights hovering unseen. There were eyes everywhere. His every word, his every step, carried the weight of hidden listeners. Yet through this suffocating net of surveillance, he pressed forward, as if guided by something beyond flesh and bone. The letters of Thomas Sankara remained locked in his private study. Encrypted messages, half deciphered, revealing fragments of a vast conspiracy older than his own lifetime. They spoke of secret treaties signed in the dark days of independence, of banks in Europe fattened by Africa's blood, of leaders who had played both sides. Some letters seemed almost prophetic, describing patterns of betrayal and resistance repeating like an eternal cycle. It was not simply history. It was a mirror reflecting his own struggle. But with revelation came doubt. If these letters reached the public, would they ignite a revolution? Or would they unleash chaos his fragile nation could not withstand? He had seen the desperation in the eyes of his people. He had heard their cries. He knew that truth alone was not enough. It needed to be wielded like a weapon. Meanwhile, the world pressed harder. A sudden cyber attack crippled the nation's banking system. Accounts froze. Salaries vanished overnight. Farmers arrived at markets with sacks of grain, only to discover no one could pay. In villages, elders told stories of famine from decades past, But this famine felt different. It was not born of nature, but engineered by distant hands that held invisible levers of power. And then came the riots. Ouagadougou burned with desperation. Crowds surged through streets, demanding food, demanding answers. Some cursed Traoré's name, accusing him of leading them into this abyss. Others shouted for him to stand firm, to defy the empire to the very end. The city trembled, torn between survival and freedom. In the midst of this chaos, a figure emerged from the shadows, an old man, thin, scarred, carrying the aura of someone who had seen the rise and fall of generations. Whispers said he had once stood beside Sankara, that he had vanished after the assassination, presumed dead. He came not as an ally, nor as an enemy, but as a messenger. He spoke in fragments, cryptic, as if time itself had eroded his words. He reminded Traoré of a truth he already knew. The fight was larger than Burkina Faso. Every night Traoré felt the walls closing in. The generals waited for the perfect moment to strike. The IMF pushed for his surrender, dangling crumbs of relief in exchange for submission. The mysterious letters on his desk seemed to glow under the dim light, urging him toward a choice that could either break him or break the chains binding his continent. The Council of Shadows, a clandestine network of African leaders disillusioned with the old order, tested him silently. They sent messages wrapped in riddles, offering hints of solidarity, but withholding full trust. They needed to know if this captain was more than a symbol, if he was willing to risk everything for a future that might never arrive. Days bled into nights, each heavier than the last. Hunger gnawed at the people, betrayal ate away at his army, and foreign powers pressed closer with every hour. Yet even as the darkness thickened, a strange current ran through the land. In the eyes of the young, in the clenched fists of workers, in the whispered prayers of mothers, there was something new, an ember, faint but alive. The world thought it had broken him. They believed the captain would kneel, as so many before him had. But Traoré, surrounded by famine, betrayal, and the machinery of empire, was preparing something no one could see, something that would shake the world to its core. The night before the summit, Ouagadougou was restless. The air was thick with tension, heavy as if the desert itself held its breath. In the barracks, soldiers whispered of betrayal. In the markets, mothers clutched their children tighter. In foreign capitals, emissaries waited for reports of the young captain's fall. To the outside world, his defeat seemed inevitable. Hunger, sanctions, and betrayal had cornered him. Yet inside the presidential compound, Traoré stood silent, his eyes fixed on the ancient letters sprawled across his desk. The pages of Sankara's handwriting pulsed with meaning, as though ink and paper carried not just words but fire. In those letters, the past and present converged. They revealed secret treaties signed in smoke-filled rooms, documents that transformed newly independent nations into silent vassals. They spoke of hidden gold routes, of pipelines of wealth running from African soil into European vaults. They named names, leaders who had sold their people for power, corporations that had built empires on African hunger. But more than revelations, the letters contained a plan. A vision so audacious that even Traoré doubted it could succeed. It was not about armies. It was not about guns. It was about exposure. The truth itself, wielded as a weapon sharper than steel. The summit was to be held in a fortress of power, hosted by Trump himself. Though no longer seated as president, his influence still cast a long shadow. He had assembled Western leaders, bankers, generals, and African elites who had long bent their knees to foreign masters. The stage was set to reinforce the colonial legacy, to reassert control, to remind nations like Burkina Faso that resistance was futile. But Traoré did the unthinkable. Against advice, against warnings, against threats of assassination, he decided to attend. Not as a guest, but as a disruptor. His arrival sent shockwaves through the hall. The young captain, dressed in the uniform of a soldier rather than the tailored suit of a statesman, carried no entourage, no bodyguards, no grand announcement. Only a leather case, worn from years of use, clutched tightly in his hand. Inside, the letters waited. The generals had made their move too. In the days leading to the summit, they had secured secret alliances with foreign powers, ready to strike at the first sign of weakness. Their plan was simple: discredit him publicly, seize power privately, and restore the comfort of the old order. To them, Traoré's audacity was madness, and his downfall inevitable. The hall was a cathedral of power. Crystal chandeliers illuminated polished floors. Flags of nations hung like trophies, reminders of centuries of conquest. Trump presided with confidence, delivering words heavy with authority, reinforcing the need for order, for stability, for partnerships. The audience applauded. Heads nodded. The machine of empire hummed smoothly. Then Traoré stepped forward. His voice was low at first, drowned by murmurs of surprise. But when he opened the case and lifted Sankara's letters high for all to see, silence fell like a hammer. He began to read. Not speeches crafted by diplomats, not slogans written for cameras, but words carved from betrayal itself. He revealed how African independence had been signed away in hidden agreements, how banks across the West bled nations dry through debts designed never to be repaid, how leaders colluded in silence while their people starved. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs grew into shouts. Some leaders rose in anger, calling his words lies. Others sat frozen, unable to meet his gaze. Screens flickered as the encrypted broadcasts, carefully prepared by his allies, spread the documents across the globe in real time. In minutes, the secrets of half a century became visible to millions. Trump, seated at the center, stared in disbelief. The world's order, meticulously built, was unraveling in front of him, not through war, but through truth. His lips parted, searching for words, but none came. For once, the showman was silent. The generals panicked. Their betrayal was laid bare. Their names appeared in the letters, their collusion exposed to the very soldiers they commanded. In that instant, their power dissolved. Troops once loyal turned their rifles away. Allies withdrew. The conspiracy collapsed not with gunfire, but with shame. The hall erupted into chaos. Some leaders stormed out. Others begged for negotiations. Journalists, though barred, had already seized the feeds. Across Africa, televisions flickered with Traoré's defiance. In villages where hunger gnawed, in cities where youth marched, in deserts where silence ruled, people watched in awe. They saw not just a captain, but a mirror of their own pain, their own rage, their own buried dreams. For 90 minutes, the young soldier dismantled centuries of empire. Not through armies, not through treaties, but through the sheer weight of truth. When he finished, the hall was unrecognizable. Shouts filled the air, alliances cracked, and the world stood on the edge of something new. Trump remained seated, his face drained of color. For once, the man who thrived on words had none. He could only stare, speechless, as Ibrahim Traoré dismantled the colonial legacy in front of him. What happened in that hall would not be contained. It had already spilled across borders, across oceans, into the hearts of millions. The old order trembled. And in the silence that followed, a single question rose like thunder. If one captain could shake the empire, what would happen when an entire continent rose with him? The chaos of the summit did not end when Traoré's voice fell silent. It spilled outward like a tidal wave, crashing against the walls of every capital, every boardroom, every dusty street in Africa, where people huddled around radios and flickering television sets. The letters of Sankara, once buried and forgotten, were now alive in the mouths of the people. They spread not as documents, but as fire. Western leaders scrambled to contain the storm. Statements were released in rapid succession, dismissing Traoré's revelations as fabrications, insisting the treaties were taken out of context, that the archives were forgeries. But the words rang hollow. The documents had been broadcast in real time, verified by multiple sources, impossible to bury. The empire's armor had cracked, and the world had seen what lay beneath. In Paris, protests erupted outside the Assemblée Nationale. In Rome, crowds gathered with banners demanding their government release the gold reserves stolen from African nations. In Washington, the Council of Power fell into disarray. Bankers whispered of collapsing contracts. Generals argued over strategies, and Trump himself sat in bitter silence, knowing that history would record his stunned face as the moment the empire faltered. But it was in Africa that the impact was most profound. Across the continent, something long buried surged upward. In Accra, students marched with signs declaring, "We will not kneel." In Lagos, workers stormed offices of foreign oil companies, demanding control of their own resources. In Dakar, women filled the streets, carrying water jars high above their heads, chanting Traoré's name as if it were both a prayer and a weapon. In Burkina Faso, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Soldiers who had once doubted now stood proudly at attention, saluting not out of fear, but out of belief. The generals who had plotted his downfall fled into the shadows, their names forever stained by betrayal. Families who had gone hungry lit fires of celebration, dancing in dusty streets, not because food had suddenly returned, but because dignity had. Yet the path was far from clear. Sanctions tightened further. International markets recoiled. Aid agencies withdrew under pressure. Hunger still clawed at the land, and famine did not vanish with the stroke of a pen. The suffering remained real, immediate, unrelenting. But alongside the suffering, a new strength emerged. Communities banded together, sharing what little they had. Farmers formed cooperatives, bypassing foreign intermediaries. Youth built networks, using technology to spread Traoré's message far beyond the reach of censorship. It was not enough to erase the pain, but it was enough to give it meaning. In the heart of Ouagadougou, the mysterious old man who had once whispered guidance to Traoré disappeared without a trace. Some claimed he had returned to the shadows. Others swore he was nothing but a ghost from the past. Yet before vanishing, he left behind a final note, handwritten and brief. The struggle is never over. Victory is not a moment, but a flame to be carried. Traoré read the words in silence, then placed them beside Sankara's letters. He understood. His defiance at the summit was not an ending, but a beginning. The world had heard him, but the price of being heard was heavy. His nation still hungered, his enemies still plotted, and the empire still had weapons he had yet to face. And yet, something irreversible had happened. The myth of invincibility was broken, the illusion of permanence shattered. For centuries, the colonial legacy had survived by convincing the oppressed that resistance was hopeless. But now they had seen with their own eyes a man who refused to kneel, and a world order that trembled in response. It was enough to turn despair into resolve. Across Africa, murals of Traoré appeared overnight. In villages and cities, walls were painted with his face, beside the resurrected image of Sankara. Their eyes, drawn in bold colors, seemed to look toward the future, daring others to follow. Elders told children the story of the summit, of the young captain who walked into a hall of emperors and spoke the truth they could not silence. And in distant corners of the world, voices began to rise in unexpected places. Indigenous leaders in Latin America cited Traoré's defiance as inspiration. Activists in Asia echoed his words, demanding freedom from financial chains. Even in Europe, where silence had long been purchased with comfort, workers questioned the costs of an empire built on someone else's suffering. Trump, for all his bluster, had become the unwilling witness of this turning point. History would not remember his speeches or his gestures, but his silence, the moment he had no words before a soldier from a small West African nation. It was not a humiliation of one man, but of the system he represented. Still, Traoré did not celebrate. He knew what had begun would test him harder than what had passed. The empire wounded was still an empire capable of cruelty. He knew assassins would come, that plots would multiply, that famine would be used as a weapon. Yet he also knew that the flame had been lit, and no darkness could fully extinguish it. Standing before his people, he raised no grand proclamations, no promises of immediate salvation. He simply stood, a captain among captains, a soldier among soldiers, a man who refused to kneel. And for his people that was enough. Enough to carry them through hunger, enough to withstand betrayal, enough to believe in something beyond despair. The colonial legacy had not vanished overnight, but it had been shaken. The world had seen the cracks, and once cracks appear, walls begin to crumble. Africa was no longer silent. The question that lingered was not whether Traoré could win alone, but whether the people he inspired would rise with him. And in the restless night air, carried on winds that crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans, a whisper echoed in countless tongues, a whisper that was no longer fear, but resolve, The chains are breaking. The dust of the summit settled, but the echoes did not fade. Across Africa, across the world, Ibrahim Traoré's name became more than a name. It became a signal, a symbol, a rallying cry whispered in crowded markets and shouted from university rooftops. In the poorest corners of Burkina Faso, where children had gone to bed with empty stomachs, fathers now lifted them onto their shoulders, pointing toward the horizon as if to say, there is a future waiting. The IMF, once untouchable, reeled from the blow. Nations that had long submitted to its terms now questioned the contracts they had signed in desperation. Ministers in hidden offices pored over the documents Traoré had unveiled, seeing in black and white the proof of betrayal they had always suspected. The myth of benevolent guardianship was dead. What remained was raw, undeniable theft. The West responded with silence, then with fury. Sanctions grew harsher, campaigns of disinformation spread across airwaves, and operatives moved through shadows, seeking ways to cut down the captain before the flames spread too far. But it was already too late. His defiance was no longer confined to Burkina Faso. It had become continental, even global. In Johannesburg, youth painted murals of Traoré and Sankara side by side, their faces emerging from brick walls like prophets returned from exile. In Cairo, students carried banners through ancient streets, demanding a new Pan-African Union built not on submission, but on dignity. In Nairobi, farmers refused to sell their harvests to foreign buyers, insisting the grain feed their own people first. Even in the diaspora, far from Africa's soil, the movement surged. In Paris, children of immigrants marched through boulevards chanting his name, shaking the city that had long pretended to own their future. In New York, voices rose in Harlem, calling him the beginning of a new chapter in black resistance. The struggle was no longer local. It was planetary, and yet, in Ouagadougou, Traoré did not crown himself a savior. He walked among his soldiers, ate from the same bowls, listened to the same laments. He reminded them again and again that he was no hero, no king, only a man carrying the weight of his people's pain. His humility made him larger than any throne could. The generals who betrayed him were gone, exiled or disgraced. Their power dissolved in the light of truth. The Council of Shadows, once hesitant, now came forward, emboldened by his courage. African leaders who had watched in silence began to speak, cautiously at first, then boldly, until a chorus began to rise. The cracks in the old order widened, the hunger remained, but it was no longer met with silence. Communities formed networks to survive, not in isolation but in solidarity. Where famine had once broken spirits, now it forged unity. In every struggle, there was the memory of the summit, of the young captain standing alone against the world and refusing to bend. And in the quiet of his study, Traoré kept the letters of Sankara beside the final note left by the old man who had guided him. The struggle is never over. Victory is not a moment, but a flame to be carried. He understood it fully now. What he had done at the summit was not victory, but ignition. The flame was in the hands of the people, and it would either spread or die depending on their will to carry it. The empire still breathed. Its armies still waited. Its banks still clutched the wealth of nations. But something deeper had shifted. Its aura of invincibility was gone. The colonial legacy, once hidden in shadows, now stood naked before the world. And against naked truth, no empire can stand forever. On a dusty evening in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before his people. He did not raise his voice in triumph. He did not speak of final victory. He simply looked into the eyes of the hungry, the hopeful, the broken, and said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. It was the silence of a man who had given everything, and the silence of a people who understood that what had begun could not be undone. From the smallest villages to the grandest cities, Africa pulsed with a question, unspoken yet alive in every heartbeat. It crossed oceans, lingered in the ears of the powerful, haunted the dreams of those who had lived by plunder. It was not a cry of despair, but of defiance, of awakening, of destiny. Was this the day Africa broke its chains?